Hi, my name is Liz Corey, and I'm the festival producer for the Red Line Book Festival. The festival is brought to you by South Dublin Libraries and Arts. I'm pleased to introduce Why the Moon Travels, featuring author Oein DeBhairduin, in conversation with award-winning young adult author Deirdre Sullivan. Please visit redlinebookfestival.ie for more information about the festival programme. But for now, I'm delighted to hand you over to Deirdre to kickstart this event. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Deirdre Sullivan. I'm a writer, and I'm here today to speak to Oein DeBhairduin, who is a creative soul with a passion for poetry, folk herbalism, and preserving the beauty of traveller tales, sayings, retellings, and historic exchanges. He is, as well as a writer and a poet, the manager of an education centre and a long-time board member of several Minkerry community groups. He seeks to pair community activism with cultural celebration, recalling old tales with fresh modern connections, and most of all, he wishes to rekindle the hearth fires of a shared kinship. His debut collection of folklore, Why the Moon Travels, is a beautiful and significant book, and that's what we're here to talk about this evening. Welcome, Oein. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. You too, especially with such a busy week you've had yourself with your own lunch.
Oh, sure. It's all go. Would you like to open up by reading a little bit from Why the Moon Travels?
I will. And the story that I'm going to read is the first story in the book itself. It's called The Yew Tree, which is Tars Sharko. And I'll just get stuck in. I spent a lot of my childhood in graveyards. Not in a morose way, but in the way that many people from the travelling community spend time in graveyards. Travellers don't often have a permanent place in life, so when we die, we mark the ground with a stone to show that we were there. We visit for funerals, of course, and the quarter mass. We also visit the graves of loved ones on birthdays, on grief days, and on high holidays, and when the extended family come to town. Every relative, every loved one, every kindred friend is remembered. We go to graveyards to be among those who stand on the edge of our shared experiences, whose dreams remind us of them, and sweetly sung songs evoke their memories, keeping them alive in stories of who and how they were and where they existed on the wiry brambles of ancestry. Of all those free and able, settled or traveller, those whose hearts were light enough to carry them to the streets of Tuam, always went to the quarter mass on the 6th of June, St. Jared's feast day. We don't willingly go to sort of places with a heavy heart in case the carrying of it would mire us to that place. There is the old graveyard and the new graveyard, and in the centre a large space filled with unmarked famine graves. We would gather in the middle, packed tightly around the graveyard as it is huge, as if we were tied together by invisible strings. In the west of the old graveyard, there is a grey sandstone memorial cemented to the wall, which is marked with no traveller's name, but is for all travellers, remembered and forgotten, buried in unmarked graves and unnamed places in the Tuam graveyard and across the very world. Unbaptized and nameless traveller children are usually buried in unconsecrated grounds, in the cradle of ancient sites, the sheens near holy monuments, blessed wells, and other sacred places. On rare occasions, traveller children would have been buried in the consecrated soil of the graveyard, which would otherwise have been denied and barred to them for having neither name nor the grace of baptismal waters. They who had lost a friend or a relative or neighbour could lay their still children at the feet of the deceased. The little baskets would be tenderly carried to the rest in unknown and trusted arms. In many of the graves of Ireland, at the feet of those who have journeyed before us, sleep swaddling children, safe in the care of kind-hearted custodians. In this graveyard, not far from my home, stands a scattering of tall yew trees, beaten by age, weather, and the waves of grief they have endured from the passing of time around them. I recall admiring them as a child, those beautiful solemn figures rooted throughout the sacred space, the high cold grey stone walls, the dark iron gates marking the boundary lines between the place of the dead and that of the living. One year, though, as we went in June, I felt as if it was an autumn morning, still and clear and crisp and cold, but the warmth of the people brought it was a reminder of the rising days of summer. I remember asking my father late that day about the yew trees, and being told about where they were, where they came from, and why they were almost always found in graveyards.
So that was beautiful, Owen. And one of the lines that really stuck with me was the about the stones that you placed to show that we were there. Because Why the Moon Travels is a beautiful book, but it's also an incredibly culturally significant one. It's the first collection of folk tales written by a traveller about travellers and illustrated by a traveller, the wonderfully talented Leanne McDonough. There is, by virtue of it giving voice and space to the rich storytelling tradition within traveller culture, an intersection of art and activism that mirrors your own professional life in a way. As you wrote it, was this something you gave a lot of consideration to? And did it fuel or hamper the process of writing it?
I think that I wanted to give myself permission just to write something. Just to write something that I would think or come across and found to be something that's beautiful. But in the writing of it, I think that there's ideas and thoughts and ambitions and all this other noise that other people hear about our lives, that the story itself began to whisper in a certain way, as many of them do. And because I think that's something that really brings us together. The power of a shared narrative in a very human ways makes us understand each other to such a far greater human level. And when the stories were kind of whispering themselves to me and growing in me, I think, because some of them, when I recall and remember them, but they change and grow and evolve in their own way. Part of that changing was how I understood the world and how the world may have not have understood me, and trying to work out how we can actually speak to each other in a different way. And so many of the stories do that, I think, or I hope in my own aspirations do that.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that does run through Why the Moon Travels is the deep respect that you have for these stories, and that kind of folklore and stories of something you've been passionate about and have been collecting all your life. Would you like to talk a little bit about the journey from the child fed and fueled by the stories that you were to the poet, writer and folklorist that you are today?
I think, like everyone's journey, it would have many a winding and bumpy road. I would have always been a scribbler. Someone I still describe myself as more of a scribbler than a writer. I've kept journals, I've kept diaries, I've kept notebooks. I'm always kind of either keeping quotes of people when they're at the protests or in significant moments in my life, or little dreams I've had, or notions or daydreams. And I think that they've always stayed with me. And growing up and being very shocked of living in somewhat a sheltered bubble of such care and such creativity and such celebration of identity and history, to the more harsher realities of what the world says about you, was quite a daunting experience. And so to normalize and reconnect with that, a lot of that was done through finding that kind of the stories in the world, and how where I'm a part of the world is part of me. And and like really listening to it and allowing it to grow in yourself and to foster and to change, and also kind of having fun with it. And I think that they ourselves just to have fun and to be as reckless as we want to be, because a story can be a story if we want it to be, but also can be something far more magical and exciting. And so I think that as someone who is a scribbler, I'm still very much making a sense of it all. And I think that's the part of the journey in and unto itself. And in fact, it might be one of the reasons why we're here at all. But and I think my story and then my review and thoughts of the stories themselves have changed. Like, one of the things is that I have somewhat of a limp, and my father has a limp, and my grandfather, Martin Camog, has a limp. So it's one of those life and inheritances. So there is a tale of this wish and a wishing well. And I never picked up at the first time I'd heard it. And every time I heard it, is that there's a moment where there's a walking stick, and it's not cast aside, it's tucked under the arm. So the idea wasn't that somehow someone was somewhat cured and made this kind of perfect walking person. It's that they were content in who they were and the blessing of who they were. And I have heard that story so many times of tucking off the stick under their arm, and had never really thought about it. Was really embracing who they were, and all they really wanted to do was to dance. And so the part of that kind of process of really writing it out, that kind of really sung to me. So the journey is forever ongoing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what a lovely journey that you've taken the reader on. One of the things that particularly, I suppose, moved me when reading Why the Moon Travels was kind of the parts of your own life that you shared. Family and community is woven through this book, and it's really used to highlight the importance of story and how formative they can be. And I'm wondering, is there a story in the collection that you feel a particularly deep connection to, or that holds a special place in your heart?
The one that usually comes up most strongly to myself is the dandelions. The story behind the birds of the dandelions, because once people read that, people say they will never look at the dandelion the same, and I think that's a huge, I think something that really inspires me to know that there's a story that I've shared that has forever changed how someone's going to look at the world, and however they look at the world in the future is going to be a little bit more magical. And that's something I think that it's something that really resonates in me. That's something that's so ordinary and everyday, and everyone knows about it, suddenly gets transformed into this entire journey that no matter how or where you are, you ever look at it, you will never look at it the same. So that tale itself is something very much in my heart, and it's one of the stories that came from my mother, who isn't overly kind of shown in the books, who is kind of a storyteller unto herself, and I think sometimes there's a lot of magic and beauty and connection in something that's so ordinary but so extraordinary at the same time.
No, absolutely, and it's so true about the dandelion. I know, kind of, when I read the story in the book, we were kind of like, I had the pleasure of reading it a bit earlier, but like, kind of walking around, you kind of look at dandelions a little bit differently afterwards, and like that is something that like does permeate the book, that sense of place and the value of wilderness and wild spaces and the interconnectedness of human beings in the natural world. There's a writer called Hugh Warwick who writes about the importance of wilderness and of connection to the wild and the impact that the lack of that can have in urban spaces. Animals and their link to us, crows, spiders, badgers, hedgehogs, owls, all feature in this collection. And there's a deep respect for them and their value, not as resources, but as beings. Would you like to speak a little bit about the importance of nature and the natural world in traveller folklore, and specifically why the moon travels? And do you have a favourite animal?
Favorite animal. I absolutely adore robins. I know there's a lot of like folklore in association with them. Robins said they're small, they're feisty. I have seen a single robin take on 3 magpies just for a bit of food, and I just thought it was like this small little like firecracker of a creature. But at the same time, they have the ability to tame humans and almost get humans to bend to their will of coming and visiting. And so many people I know regularly feed a robin. I'm like going, this creature is so good at domesticating humans, for its own needs. And I think the connection with nature is a connection I think it's within all people. It's just that due to the situations travelers have found themselves in, the closeness to nature itself was more sustained, and that break is a more recent one. And the living so close to the edge of life and death with nature and experiencing it far more raw, everyday way has meant people, I suppose, a little bit more aware about the dangers and the pleasures and the way that we both coexist together. And I like how you said earlier that it's not they're not just resources; they're a part of the world around us, and it's something that most certainly is in like Irish history and Irish folklore and the sense of being of most people in Ireland. However, in the last, I would say, 50 years, there's a huge space between the world around us and the world that we think we live in. And this kind of hierarchy of where we are and everything is beneath us and serves us. And I think within kind of traditional traveller kind of I suppose focus, that link isn't fully broken yet because people still live with that kind of sense of it. But I do see, and I know that it's been shown through research that from the time where travellers were moved from our more kind of traditional nomadic spaces and trends, life expectancy dropped dramatically, health dropped dramatically. One of the things that like most people do, and even now kind of times of kind of mourning or loss, people have a need to go to nature. That it's within us, it's within our folklore, it's within our even our remedy of like going, spend some time outside. Rather than not just go to your doctor and receive medical care, but like spend some time outside, like let life be around you and in you, rather than the bubbles that we create.
No, absolutely, and it is very true that can be that can be a great healer, just to kind of, and even like I find just reminding yourself that like we're not the only thing that's breathing here, you know, we're not the only thing that needs the world. It's something that we all have to kind of go back to increasingly. In terms of going,
oh no, I just had a thought, and you were saying as in terms of going back, and we will go back to that too. I think that animals and nature and the wilderness, especially on a personal level, it brings such a deep balm of support to myself. That when you're in a world where there's so much chaos and a world where there's so much unknown, to know where a badger's stripes came from, to know that the moon is traveling, to know that crows have hoods for a certain reason, gives a sense of belonging. That while the world of man can be so chaotic, the world of nature is very honest in its givings and its takings. It makes no promises. But at the same time, it allows us to feel that we are truly a part of it if we at the utmost least remember our relationship with it.
No, absolutely. And yeah, it's lovely. I just want to go.
It really
is. So bringing me on to my next question before I get distracted by history from pre-Christian Ireland to famine times plays a role in the stories in this collection, and it also gives a real sense to the reader of the enduring power of our folklore, not only in a personal sense but also from a historic standpoint. Is there a particular era or time period that fascinates you in terms of story?
I would say, and I think it would be a period because it's not exactly a time, is that I have a fascination with my grandparents' and their lives. Because it's usually 4 generations back that we lose that connection with people. Like within our families, like we can go back like 7 generations. We know their names. I know my grandparents' names and where they lived and where they were buried. But I don't know what their favorite song was. And I don't know who their best friend was. And I don't know if they liked brisk mornings or wet evenings. And I think there's a whole world that sometimes behind us just gets forgotten. And we remember some of the details of people. We remember their names or sounds, but we don't really remember them. They're too far back for us. So I think that generation, like the idea of what secrets did they hide? You know, like what was their first thoughts in the morning? Why did they name their children the names they named them? There are all these thoughts and ideas of like these unexplored mysteries and puzzles that at the time for someone was so raw and so important that it's just so very recently behind us. And because I growing up, my grandmother would tell us about her grandparents, and it was filled with life. And I always kind of felt going, I'd loved if I could have met that, not just them, but the people of that space and that time, because unless you were famous, had literacy levels and skills and ability, and also the ability to protect what you've written. And because we know through time that many of our kind of amazing writers and their work has only survived because of the ability to lock it up in somewhere dry. You know, and the idea of going, they are the untold stories, and their stories live in us because we're part of them. So that the ability to discover little things about ourselves. I often think, going, why do I have a love for that? Or is that like no one in my family has it? I wonder where that came from. Or is it just myself? Or is that whispering part of your body talking to yourself, and the world kind of going, oh, I remember, and you remember too.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Finding out about great grandmothers is interesting. At the beginning of lockdown, my mum found out that she had the same birthday as her grandmother, who passed away in the Spanish flu pandemic.
Yeah. Wow, 1918.
Yeah. Or great grandmother maybe. Anyway, they were both called Mary and they had the same birthday, and no one had ever made that connection. She just managed to find the birth cert, and she was so struck by it. Well, kind of, it's those things of like people not taking the time to tell each other, or people not having the resources to remember, you know. It's kind of magical when something is found again. Stories designed to be read or spoken aloud have a particular magic to them too, and there's a sort of an enchantment between the listener and the teller. The stories you tell were passed down from generation to generation, and can you talk a little bit about the process of transforming them from voice to page?
Yeah, so my process, which I'm learning all the lingo, was that I sat down, I spoke it out, and I muse over it, and kind of going, is this how it's resting in me? And I
Yeah.
listened to it, and I would record it again, and then it came to script writing it, and there was parts of it that like didn't gel together because I forget that there's parts of the story that's in my head that I know they may not necessarily be in the paper. I'm trying to be
Yeah.
so very consciously aware that I'm creating a story, not the story. And
Yes.
like it's a version of another version. And sometimes people look back, and especially to the older chronicles, going on, oh, that was these stories. They go, oh no, that was the story the day it was written. So it doesn't mean that was the story the day after, or the day before. And so writing to it, I think that I wanted very much to ensure that that oral tradition was very much naturally a part of it, and the same way it's like part of our Gammon language. So if I would have said like going home to the Kenya, I would literally have read going home to the Kenya. I didn't want to edit those things out. And
Yes.
because suddenly you're creating more of a product rather than this kind of attempt to give something that someone understands, but also to make it very authentically real and like intimate. Kind of going, here is something that I carry, I find is important, and I want to share with you in a genuine way. And the only way you
Yes.
can do that is actually that you let them go as well, but trusting that you're not editing it in a way that's it's about, oh, I wanted to make it sound amazing. It's like going, they are already amazing. I'm just going to try my
Yes.
best to capture that and pass it on.
Yeah, the truth of them and the power of them. And I think it's definitely something that resonated with me as I read it. You've mentioned in a previous interview with the Dublin Inquirer that you whittled down the number of stories to 20 from a collection of more than 100. I'd love to know, like, that's a job of work. I'd love to know more about how that process worked, and if there were any stories that were particularly difficult to set aside for the moment.
Mm-hmm. There were stories that I wanted to capture about direct family members and
Yeah.
grandparents and granduncles. But there's a tale of, and there's a version of these tales go back to the 1700s. And I have my grandmother's uncle was a man called Jack, and he was known as the Hare. And when he was 17, he was hunting with his family members, three of the brothers, and the hound caught a hare. It tussles the hare into a brambles. They went in after it, and on the other side of the brambles stood a woman. Now, this version of this tale has come up many, many times in different hair stories, but they recall it actually seeing this woman, and she was bleeding from her leg. So Jack immediately thought the hare had transformed into the woman, and he was hospitalized, and we were able to find his medical record. So he was hospitalized, and it could have been like a mental breakdown or a transformation kind of experience, but he did spend 7 years in hospital. And I really wanted to catch that story of how, was that a trauma reissuing itself? Was that a well-known story just repeating itself, or was that someone's narrative to deal with a crisis, or did it actually really happen? Because something clearly happened. And sometimes going, but what they recalled and what they told wasn't that he got into a state, he was in hospital. Is that they went hunting, there was a hare, the hound caught it, and they transformed it into a woman. And I just thought, going, that in itself, it tells so much about how people were willing to deal with situations, of how they processed it, or how they told other people about it, but also how it brought them comfort. Is that this situation happened because something so bizarre happened, you know, and it was also guilt free because almost the word was live. So that was one of the tales I wanted to tell. And with speaking to families, I go, too new, too raw, too complicated. We'll share it in more detail at some stage. But it was more or less looking at the stories, how they flowed. Also, which ones came to the surface first? Because you look at them all and you're kind of going, these ones are bubbling up, kind of going, oh, that wants attention. For every reason, that's the one that wants attention. And I kept going back to it. But there was one tale that we had worked on, and it was a tale of where snails and slugs came from. And the difference of it, and it's really an analogy of like the Seth community and the Trafford community. And we had worked on it, and for some reason, it didn't end up in the book. And we don't know why. But there is also whispers at the moment of actually potentially transforming it into a children's book. So that may be why it disappeared. But we had worked on that story, and then it just suddenly was gone, and then suddenly it came back. And that in itself, I just thought was like going, oh, that's why suddenly it just fell out of our heads. Oh, it's by just talking about it and me musing it, and me going, it's like, is that the essence of that story? Or am I misremembering it? And then suddenly it was gone, and now it's back. And so I think the process is natural and organic, and I think the idea of bubbling it up and not slaving over stuff and just having fun with it is probably why it happened. Because I think if I was in the agony of that line doesn't fit me, I wouldn't have finished.
No, absolutely. And kind of, I think it's a very respectful process, kind of listening to what the stories demand of you and kind of honoring what they need, as opposed to like making them serve you, you know, kind of. Though, like, I mean, obviously your voice is wonderful and the language used to tell the stories is so evocative and poetic. One of the things that you mentioned in the introduction of the book is about the three primary aspects to the telling of your tales. That they are contextualized in the moments and space in which they're shared, that they are told as entertainment, and also that they are presented as truthful and real. The stories are part of your community and history, but they're also given such artful and poetic voice by your gift for language. I was lucky enough to hear you read at your launch, and I noticed that the story that you told shifted a little then from the written text. Are they constantly still evolving? And can you speak a little bit about the collaborative nature of building a book like Why the Moon Travels?
It's forever changing, forever adapting, forever retelling itself, finding new contrasts, finding new ideas. Like going, like we have a figure in some of the stories called Gidge, and like Gidge in some of her tales has died 1,000 times. She's married 100 men. You know, she's had like thousands of adventures over water and mountains, and for some reason, Gidge is still the same person. And
Yes.
you know, and see, Gidge is, yeah, and it's like, and see, she seems to be consistently her, while all these other faces of herself. And yeah, so I think the stories recall, but also I think that's very much a part of our tradition that we retell it. And even we came at one stage that there will be an audiobook coming out in November, and we went looking for someone to capture that the sound and tone of it. And one of the people we did go to was my father, and in the end it was for him. But my God, that man could not finish the single sentence without changing it. Even it was in front of him, and he'd look and go, "This happened." No, it was so a part of it. Like going, no. That fox didn't run that way. He ran this way. You know, and that's the fun of it. Like the idea of it going, we should always be allowed to change it, and it should always be allowed to change in us, because they are living. They are very, very much living. And I think the collaborative kind of process really draws out the idea of, am I telling this story to myself only? Because I think they are stories we tell to ourselves. Am I telling this story to myself only? Or am I telling the story in a way that the people can actually understand the story, can grasp it? And there are parts where there's moments where we bridge, where I think I've actually drawn out the lines because it's in me, it's in my heart, but I actually haven't told you about it. I've just assumed you jumped over that. So by being a part of the collaborative process, it opens up the idea of people ask questions and draw things out and wondering of, where did that happen? What happened there? And you go, oh, this is because that happened. Oh, did not? Oh, is that on this? Oh, that's not down there. I've changed that. You know, and that kind of gives it that kind of the freedom of, that's how we would do stories. We'd sit at the end, kind of going, and what happened to him? You know, and having that kind of as part of the stories, involved in the stories, I think was a very fun part of it, but also a very accurate part of this, trying to transfer an oral story tradition into a scripted book. And another way you can do that is you open up those spaces and allow those spaces to remain open.
Yeah, no, open spaces, they're beautiful things. Wondering, when you were, do you think about how you would like, or during the writing process, did you think about how you would like your book to be experienced by readers in their own particular spaces and moments? And I'm sure a myriad of different locations. As it journeys into the world, people will find their own truths and their own joys in it. And did you consider that while you were working on it? And was there anything in particular you hoped people would come away with?
That would bubble up all the time, but it was something that I didn't want to spend too much attention to, because the idea that you end up wanting to control the story and the narrative, and I could try to push people down a certain path. So there would be, is that I wanted people to, first off, because of the spaces that we're talking about, like not only are they open, but sometimes they're very distant from each other. And then while we can be in the same space, the same world, we can be strangers. So one of the things I wanted for people to have an insight into a culture and a community that I find absolutely fascinating, so much fun, so much joy, and people only know of the issues and the loss and the pain, and they don't actually know anything about the people and where it comes from. And like that's one of the things I really wanted to spark in people up going, we may at times treat each other as strangers, but we're always kith and kindred. We are always kith and kindred.
That's yeah, that's lovely. And I do think that it is quite radical to share kind of and important to share joyful celebratory narratives about travelers, because like so often like the news stories that we hear are so laced with pain, you know, and there's more to people than their pain, you know. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I got the pain, but also championing the ordinary as well at times becomes really surreal for me. Like, and it is important because if a young girl from a very popular kind of background finishes her leaving cert, that's important. But sometimes when I read those stories, part of my heart drops because I'm going, why is this so unusual? Why is this being picked up as this is unusual? Do you know, and the idea is like going, someone doing their leaving cert, it should not be world shattering. But at the moment, it's still for a lot of people with the education progressions. And I often find that even when we're celebrated, it's always within the size of, oh, bless them. Oh, God, the little hearts, you know, rather than the idea of like strong, powerful people just in a situation and structure that like is unkind at times, but still strong and powerful people. You know, as a community, the ability to resource and resist and sustain, and despite all these other worlds and noises and narratives, have remained, and not only have remained, refused to be assimilated and blushed away with the winds of time, and saying that we are here, we're not going anywhere. Can we remind each other that we are family? And I think that's one of the things that I think is starting to come to people now, is that travellers are not going anywhere. And it's about time that we actually start working towards and with each other rather than pushing each other away.
Yeah, and no more than kind of with storytelling, like one of the important things in that is to kind of amplify voices of travellers and to amplify the stories that are worth sharing, rather than communicating a view of people through a settled lens, which doesn't, you know, it doesn't serve anyone really. I'm wondering, this book is also beautifully illustrated by Leanne McDonough, who is a fabulous artist. I'll show you guys some of the, I have the book with me. Her drawings are absolutely spectacular. I'll show you because I absolutely adore the dandelion one. And there's such joy in seeing the different art forms come together and share space. And in kind of seeing how you interpreted the stories in your own mediums so beautifully. Can you speak a little about how you came to work together on this? And would you collaborate with her again?
I would most certainly collaborate with her again. She's incredibly hardworking, but also very easy to work with. And just open to ideas. And how it was is that like the world is quite small, especially within kind of the spheres of travellers. And I met her 7-8 years ago, and I think I've mentioned this before. Is that at the end of our first 5 minutes, she was like, "Oh, shh, write a book." And I did. So when I was writing, I was like, yeah, you know. And she's a wonderful skilled kind of like fine artist. In fact, we're hoping to have that shared medium space in Limerick kind of in the coming months. We hope it all going well. And part of it was that I wanted to go, like we looked at some her rarely like drawings and kind of and musings on it, and they would be, you're retelling a story that I've retold. You're absolutely free to do that. You know, and I was really interested in going, oh, that's how she saw the giant, and oh, that's what the bees look like, and you know, and I was like going, oh, that's not, I didn't see that way, but I love the fact you did, because I would never have looked at the world that way. And so she, although she's drawing something, she's retelling her story to me. I'm going, this is now a new story for me. The story has changed even again. And that kind of openness, I think, is really important. The way that it may not always be true in our tradition, but allow people the creative sense to retell things is very important. Because I do think there is those traditions as and you yourself will be a reteller in one way. There's the retelling of stuff and reviving it and giving life, but also creating your own. And then there is this structure and these kind of people who retell things by detail exactly, and there's this need to be 100% accurate. And I always think this accuracy, it's an illusion because somebody decided that was the original version. So what you're doing is that you're only being accurate to a single version of it, which is fine, no judgment. But same, I think you may in fact just be also be robbing yourself of all these other things that these stories could tell you about the world, but also about yourself. And seeing how Leanne would capture some of the tales and change them have been absolutely fascinating. And I know one of her earlier drawings of the dandelion, it was just the outline of it. Like I don't have any, but I was genuinely contemplating going, I might get a tattoo. Do you know? And you know, I just thought going, oh, she's caught this surreal moment and the image, and it's such a vibrant and strong and distinct one. I thought going, oh, I might get a tattoo. Now I haven't, you know, I don't have a single tattoo yet anyways, but if I was to, it would definitely be something that like that.
Yeah, no, and to commemorate, actually, kind of that's where I started getting tattoos. They were kind of linked to the books. Yeah, I wrote needlework, and I had no tattoos, and I was like, I can't write a book about it. Girl who wants to be a tattoo artist and have one, and then you just keep going though. But that dandelion is stunning. Wondering a kind of about something you've said previously is that traveling for us is not just a physical act, but it is a perception of life and how we engage with one another. It's such a natural thing that the moon itself does it. And this book takes the reader on an evocative and compelling journey. It's unforgettable, but it also kind of makes me like I'm someone who is quite hungry for stories and greedy for books by writers I really like. I'm wondering where your voice is wandering at the moment, and if there's a new project that you're currently working on.
There actually is. I'm working on a collection of folk tales. They're based around the ghost stories. So some of them are going to be traditional ghost stories and the creatures and the embodiments that we've had, and some of them are going with my own imagination and dreams and horrors. And you know, and I was very struck by we had many creatures and like puga of the night and creatures and ghosts and goblins, and, you know, that the wider community didn't have, that I absolutely assumed was in the general population. Like we've this figure called the Twiggy Woman, who's kind of her main focus, that she punishes cruel adults who being wronged children. Obviously, they wake up at night and they're a bundle of sticks instead of the person left behind. There's the click clock man who walks behind people at night, is unseen, but you hear footsteps at night. You know? There's the Shalaman, and Shalaman actually takes the voice of a loved one to trick people over hills into rivers to drown, that you never see, but has the exact voice of the person you trust the most. So the idea would be, even though, and that is part of our tradition, that if someone calls you, you don't reply to them until you see them. Like in casual, when you're at home or on your own. So if you're out and about, obviously, if you're with friends, you can't find them. It'd be different. But if you're on your own, your own little world, and someone calls you, you don't reply to it until you know it's actually the person. So we grew up with these ideas and these tales, and then I was talking about people going, "Oh, these aren't part of the wider narrative of the ghost stories of the Irish people. And if they are, they've forgotten them to a large degree." So I'm having a lot of fun at that. Turns out I do like to scare myself, and it's coming into the dark of the year, so the perfect time, you know, to get a few extra grey hairs. But yeah, and that itself also is growing, so it's a very organic process as well, and learning about what people's ghost stories that they remember. So there's a ghost story everyone says, "Oh, that's my ghost story," and then you kind of going, "But what's the one that really shook you and creeped you and terrified you, that you're not ready to tell me just yet? Because that's the one that got you. Is that the one of, oh, I heard that now and down, he had no head." It's like oh yeah, that night where we saw the hand. Yeah, that was the one. And so I think it's about getting those and trailing them out. And I'm really enjoying the process, actually. Really quite enjoying the process. Turns out, like, yeah, again, I do like to scare myself. And hopefully when people read them, they'll get some of that kind of, the spirit of that kind of, the world is incredibly beautiful, but also, my God, it can be a scary place.
Yeah, and I think there's such a joy to a ghost story. I know I adore them, but it's that kind of it's a really safe way to be scared, do you know?
Yeah, and you give yourself the permission to, like, and you do, and you have to know that kind of, the grace of, I'm safe, but am I? I'm okay, But anyway, yeah, and we get a bit of fun out of it because you know that you are okay, you're fine, and this is room open. But you have that thought of like going, maybe, just maybe, and yeah. So it's fun. It's fun.
This is it, and we're no more than like kind of going around and seeing dandelions in a different way, like a ghost story, like a door will creak and you'll see the world differently. Or now I know the next time my husband calls me, I'll be like,
Is that you?
just gonna check. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, Oein. It was a treat to talk to you. And Why the Moon Travels is it's an exceptional book, and if you haven't read it, just go out and buy it, and buy it for younger people as well, because I wish I heard some of these stories as a child, you know. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time.
And thank you very much, Deirdre. As always, it's been incredibly enjoyable. Thank you.